me just move a couple of windows here so that I can see things better. So this theory of change process actually started 2 years ago under Lori's leadership on the board, as she said when she did her introduction. Hey, Lori, good to see you, or hear you at least. And the motivation, the incentive really is that we need to be clearer about the change we're seeking and the impact we're having as a network. And that's kind of essential to the communications, the movement building, the impacts that we're having for funders, for all of you in terms of, the responsibility we have for the many volunteers and members that put time into the change that we're seeking. So we did a first year of work with a developmental evaluator and presented a first draft at the annual general meeting that looked a bit like this. I don't know, people, if we were in a room, I'd ask people to raise your hand or something. I can't see hardly anyone, but if you're at the AGM last year, and there was actually nearly 100 people there, it was the best one I've ever been to, but you would remember this presentation. So it had a few of the essential elements: the vision, the mission, some points about how change happens, and 4 outcomes at the bottom. All of these have been used again in the new theory of change. So I'm just going to touch on them quickly because you'll see them later. But at the top is the vision, right, which has been pretty stable for some time: sustainable and inclusive communities directing their own futures. In the middle, the orange text is our mission, which is about connecting people and ideas for action to build local economies that strengthen communities and benefit everyone. That's been pretty consistent over recent years as well. The smaller blue text offers some specifics about how we work. And this was a bit newer this year: challenging the status quo on the left, building alternatives on the right is kind of all what CED has been about since the beginning. And at the bottom, the text in blue also has some new elements, making clear the central role of lived experience and how we take an intersectoral and collaborative approach. And that intersectional descriptor or term was actually very consciously and deliberately anew and used in this the new version of the theory of change last year. So it was already there. Anchoring the theory of change that was presented last year were 4 outcome areas. Building support for CED means primarily the policy work. Centering lived experiences, I think, is self-explanatory. Contributing to climate solutions, and increasing CED initiatives, which is primarily means knowledge, skills, tools, and resources for people. So that was the theory of change a year ago. That's what we presented to the AGM for feedback. And the feedback we got in general was quite positive, right? Especially the content, the outcome areas related to lived experience and climate were newer, I think, in terms of an emphasis or explicit attention in our work, and people liked those. But it was felt that there was also needs to be a clearer articulation of why we're doing what we're doing, that there was needed some more context for the what of the theory of change. So we took that away to try to build a framework around it that helps explain why we're doing what we're doing and how we do it, that will allow people coming to it, newer, to understand what CCEDNet is about and why they should get involved. So here we have the new version, and I might just ask, I don't know if Raisa or Matthew can pop a link in the chat there that people can, you can download it as well and have a look at yourself for yourself, but I'll go through these items and we'll zoom in on the text, which is a bit small. But you can see there's a fair bit more text, which is the context and background we added. We also added more geese because it's good to stay on brand. And so before I get into the new stuff, I'll just point out what stayed the same. The vision is still there, the sunlight, the guiding direction for all the rest: sustainable, equitable, and inclusive communities directing their own futures. The mission is still the same down there at the bottom right, about connecting people and ideas for action. We have the 4 intermediate outcomes. They've been tweaked. We'll go through some of the changes, but the same basic focus areas are still the same: policy work, lived experience, climate and ecological viability with an equity lens, and strengthening practice or capacity of members. The previous text about how change happens is still there, but a lot has been added, so we'll come back to that in a second. Let's start with the new elements. The first one, the major new element, is this problem statement up in the top left. And that really attempts to clarify or to articulate the problem that we're trying to address. This is like the starting point. And so I'll come back to look at each of these specifically, and we'll zoom in so you can read them actually. But the how change happens notes some of our underlying assumptions, describes what we mean by CED, describes what our members do, and names what we think are some of the essential characteristics, even more information about how we do what we do. The 4 outcomes I mentioned previously, and there wasn't a timeline attached to them last year. And so we've clarified that these are kind of what we call intermediate outcomes with a 3-year timeline to be able to track some change related to that. And we added a long-term outcome that has a 5-year timeline. The last thing in terms of additions down here at the bottom right are the values and the roles we play. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to look at each of the new items separately a bit closer. So the problem statement, here we have the global economy in its current form incentivizes extraction, exploitation, and endless growth. It concentrates capital and control, leading to poverty, climate catastrophe, and widespread inequality in Canada and around the world. I think that's things are bad. Take your umbrella because it's raining under the problem statement. And I think this kind of sums up the reason why people, many of us, I would say, understand the problem being in the economy, and that really needs to change for the environment and well-being and people to thrive. So that's our articulation of the problem statement. The next section I'll jump into, and there'll be a chance for clarifying questions, and then, as Katie said in the breakout groups, we'll be able to discuss how this resonates with you or not later on. But so how change happens. This is actually a pretty significant change, I would say, or articulation, clarification with this new version. The first part here is where we say that if we want to change the economy, that organizing our relationships in a place actually matters, and that community economies can be sites of transformation. And then we describe what we think represent, or the characteristics of what we think represent effective community economic development approaches and strategies, which over time, if we're right, strengthen the work that you all do, that our members do, and allow CCEDNet to focus our activities to best support them. So I'm sorry, there's a bit of reading here, but I think this is a really important text. Community economic development approaches the following characteristics create the most relevant, resilient, adaptive, equitable, and effective strategies for communities to benefit and thrive. Those are strategies that are place-based, strengthening local ownership and control, democratic, community-driven, community-led, and asset-based, that engage and build the capacity of community members, primarily those who are most affected by decisions, to be agents for their own future, and protect and restore ecosystems and ecological health. At the bottom, we say, of course, these strategies are constantly evolving, right? They're adapting to new realities, new tools, technology, processes, learning, evolving, improving based on experiments and continual learning. And that's the same for, I'd say, even this whole theory of change. It's a learning exercise, it's developmental, and these characteristics probably, I would expect, will change over time as we learn and refine our understanding of what effective practices are composed of. This is where we're at for the moment. There's a final paragraph under the How Change Happens section that describes who our members are, organizations, networks, individuals across Canada that use participatory, democratic, innovative, and entrepreneurial strategies. Those documents are, those descriptors, participatory, democratic, innovative, and entrepreneurial, are actually from the earliest documents about CEDNet and were categorized under values. And we moved them here because they're slightly, I think they're not exactly values, but they're characteristics of those practices. But the strategies that challenge status quo and build alternatives, you can see is a carryover from last year, it's consistent. And the intersectional, intersectoral, and collaborative approach is consistent here as well, led by people and communities who are experts in their own lives. So that gets us through the big text. I'm supposed to be done this in 15 minutes, so that's why I'm going so fast, my apologies. Let's see how the 4 outcomes have evolved. There's the same 4 general categories, as I said. The first one related to policy work. And the previous version talked about increased political and public will to support CED. And this is just slightly adjusted to say increased public demand and political action, because I think what we understand, we realize, is that political action is often driven by public demand. And that, I would say, is a major barrier for us in community economic development or social innovation, social finance, is public understanding of the solutions, the alternatives that we're proposing, and how we help political champions and allies act because there is sufficient public demand for that action. So it's just a bit of a clarification around the policy advocacy work. Outcome B there is, this is a reformulation that's actually fairly important. The CED strategy is co-created by diverse sources and voices, seeking collective liberation through economic justice by centering people and communities as experts in their own experiences. And this is something that the Theory of Change Working Group and the board actually took some time thinking about the choice of words we want to use. And it's related to the notion of intersectionality in the previous section. And some of them, we did a fair bit of reading and thinking about the term collective liberation. And in some of the materials about collective liberation, there's a quote from Indigenous activist Lila Watson that's used. She says, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because our liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." I think that's the spirit that we want to bring to the solutions that we think community economic development has to offer. Collective liberation means recognizing that struggles and well-being are connected, and that we have to work together to create the kind of world we know is possible. In systems of oppression, exclusion, extraction, everyone suffers. And so we all need to be part of the solutions jointly. Outcome C, this is just a slight tweak. In the previous version, we talked about contributing to climate solutions. And here we talk about CED approaches and strategies addressing the ecological and climate crisis in ways that enhance equity. So it's not just the climate crisis, but the broader ecological crises we're facing, and making sure that CEDNet members, or I'd say CED approaches and strategies, take into account climate crisis and ecological crises, and that economic alternatives strengthen equity and inclusion while enhancing sustainability. The last outcome has the same focus on capacity and learning, but the scope has shifted towards CEDNet members. We used to talk about CED practitioners as a whole, and I think feeling was that focusing on CEDNet members is actually a scope where we feel we can make a difference at sort of this stage in the implementation of the theory of change. So those are the outcomes. After the intermediate outcomes, all we have left are the long-term outcomes and values and roles. So the long-term outcome here is that more communities are using CED approaches to strengthen sustainable and locally controlled economies for all. And at the bottom of the infographic, beside the mission, which has stayed the same, we added values and roles. The first three of those values, inclusion, diversity, and equity, have been consistent going back 20 years to CCEDNet's first materials. They've been there, but we added some new values related to dignity, self-determination, solidarity, and local control. And the section under roles we play helps clarify what CCEDNet does as a network to advance all of that.